In a minute, we'll open it up, and it will be Dr. Ludmila Hotchis and Jose Safanelli, both Woodwell scientists here that do fantastic work, and we'll do that deep dive in a few minutes. But before we go there, I want to tell you about some of the upcoming climate conversations over the next few months, and then also tell you a little bit about how I've been spending my last few days. So upcoming ones, we're kind of on an ag theme. Today you're going to hear about some really large-scale agriculture that they're both involved in, not in our neck of the woods, but a bit farther south. And then next month, let's see, the date is June 10th, we'll have Chris Neal, senior scientist here at Woodwell, and Andrew Woodruff, who's a farmer on Martha's Vineyard and also part of the Island Grown Initiative. They'll be here, and we'll be talking about, again, agriculture as we are tonight, but on a much smaller scale, sort of the local and regional scale. So there'll be some interesting contrast there, I'm sure. So that's June 10th. After that, July 22nd, we'll have Conrad Anker as the main speaker. Raise your hand if you've heard of Conrad Anker. All right, so yeah, okay. So Conrad is sort of just a legendary mountain climber. He's been around for a while. He's had multiple kind of first descents on the big mountains of the world. And he's also a guy who has a deep connection to this planet and thinks really hard about climate change. He's on the board of Protect Our Winters POW, which is a neat organization. And so, yeah, we'll be kind of talking about climate change and his experiences and what we can all do. And we're just super enthusiastic to not only have all of you here again, but also bring in different audiences. So we'll try to advertise this to different people and get a different crowd in. So that's July 22nd. August 12th, Joe Kennedy III will be the featured speaker. You may have heard of this guy. He's also on the Woodwell board, so I'm sure that will be an engaging conversation. Two more I'll mention. So we don't have the date yet nailed down in September, but the speakers will be Peter Frumhoff, a scientist here at Woodwell, and Shuchi Talati, whose organization I forget, but the topic will be in the realm of geoengineering and solar radiation management. And how should we be thinking about this topic? And that's sure to elicit strong emotions across the range. And I'll say I find it a fascinating topic, and we're trying to figure out our role if there's something that we can contribute to the conversation here at Woodwell. And then the next one, again, this is not the next one, but this is in January? Yeah, sometime in January. Do any of you know this book, The Ministry for the Future? The author is Kim Stanley Robinson. And we'll be talking about this book, and hopefully we'll get many of you to read this book beforehand. Kim will be, or Stan, I think he goes by, will be tuning in by Zoom. But I'll say it's a fascinating book. It's a climate fiction, but it's one of the books that really resonated with me because none of it seemed unrealistic. And part of it was absolutely horrifying. And then ultimately, maybe not so much. So he's a fascinating author, fascinating book, and we'll have that discussion. Yeah, so how have I been spending my last few days, or I'll say maybe a few weeks, a bunch of different things, but what I want to bring up, so this is annual budgeting season, which is an amazing, it's so much fun, and we think about our expenses and we think about our revenue, but it's striking what a different organization this is now than what it used to be, and I wanted to just try to share some of those things. So our annual budget's around $36 million, something like that. So that's the amount of money we need to come up with next year, and that's the amount of money we did come up with this year. It used to be, for most of the history of the organization, most of the funding came from the federal government. So it was our fantastic scientists would write proposals to the National Science Foundation, to NASA, to some federal agency. They would, and the money that we got from the grants would fund the science, and the sort of overhead would fund the organization. And one of the smartest things that we ever did was about 10 years ago, let's say 2016. At that time, most of our funding was coming from the federal government. And after that 2016 election, we were concerned about the future of federal funding. So we made the decision to try to diversify our funding streams. The good news is back in 2016, they were not very effective at cutting federal funding, but we were quite effective at diversifying. And thank God, because here we are today, and the federal funding situation is much bleaker, but the philanthropic support is much greater. So I'll say that, knock on wood, but this has been a heck of a year or 15 months or whatever it is at this point, but we continue to go strong and we continue to have support. We certainly have lost federal funding, but the philanthropic support has continued. And that is it's due to lots of different things, but the great news is that we have a relatively limited number of really big supporters that keep us going, as well as, a bunch of other less, that don't write the checks as big. But it's not it keeps me up at night because there's that limited number that really keep this place funded, and if they get other interests or something like that, we're really vulnerable. So one of the things we're really going to be leaning into on this is back to the budget, how do we get more stability and sustainability and stuff like that, because overall we don't have that many donors. So we need more donors of, I don't care what the number is, that just send the $10 every year, because that we can count on. It's the 3 or 4 that are sending the $1 million is wonderful, but we don't know, that could change. So that is all my way of saying thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoy it. And what's the movie cost these days? Well, let's think about that, a similar amount for this kind of thing. All right. Luigi and Jose. I sometimes find myself at this place. I mean, I often find myself at Woodwell, but sometimes I think, how in the heck did I get here? You know, and we all have our stories, and I didn't imagine that this is where I would be 60 years ago. But I could imagine for you, it's even a more unlikely story how you ended up on a stool in front of an audience in Woods Hole on Cape Cod in the United States. So my question to each of you is almost an impossible one, but in the next 2 or 3 minutes, tell us your story. How did you end up here at Woodwell? And yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Hi, everyone. My name is Jose. I'm originally from Brazil, and thank you very much for coming today and hosting me, Max. So everything started because I have some connections with agriculture. My grandparents, they were small farmers in the south of Brazil. I was born in Canoinhas, a small town in Santa Catarina. And then, you know, going the summer to my grandparents' house, hanging out with my cousins, I saw like how agriculture was happening, the struggles my uncles they were having. And then, yeah, this led me to study agronomy, soils, and then because of that, I was able to apply for a postdoc position here at Woodwell in 2022, and now I'm here. So maybe looking back, how about my journey. So when I was growing up as a kid in that small town, I went to a vocational school, and I essentially lived like as a farm. We had like a WOP. We grow vegetables, fruits. Yeah, and then I learned how everything was happening with soils, with crops, and essentially I then decided to go to college to study agronomy. And when I was there, I met like a professor, a great mentor, and he introduced me to soil science and to climate change and how soils are important for this problem we are facing now. More recently, we are giving more emphasis, right? And then after going to college to study agronomy, I ended up going to University of São Paulo, where I got my PhD in soil science. And, you know, after earning my degree, I was on Twitter, like following a bunch of scientists. One of the scientists was John Sanderman, my current supervisor, and he just announced a postdoc position. And then I thought, oh my God, this is a great fit for me. And I talked to my wife, and she said, yeah, please apply, and it's going to be a big move, but I fully support you. And in 2022, yes, I came here to the US, and I've been here for 4 years, working with John, working the soil carbon group, working with diverse and different projects. And I'm very glad to be here and, you know, addressing this problem, tackling this problem of climate change. Yeah.
Yeah, and like Jose, I was born and raised on a farm. Actually, my grandparents were all in this farm, and it's a special place. It's called Minas Gerais, and there are like many jokes out there about this place because people are so nice. And to tell you how nice we are, so you know, for those that live in a farm, do you know that unique sound of the pigs when they are being slaughtered? When we heard that, we knew that we would eat a very good meat that night, because if you slaughter a pig, you get like you give the best cuts to your neighbor, and you stay with the less desirable ones. So everybody does that, so everybody's benefited. So this is the kind of neighborhood that I was born in. And then I got to know farming systems in all the other places. During the pandemic, I got stuck in the research station that we have in the Amazon for 3 months, and it was like a 100,000 hectares farm. And I would starve there because they didn't plant any kind of food that was edible for me. And for me, it's unacceptable. And if you think that geoengineering is interesting and would raise a lot of like comments and things, wait until you see when I say that forests are part of the crop system infrastructure. Farms need standing forests in order to keep producing in a resilient and steady pace. And because I had those ideas, I started to work in Mato Grosso, and Woodwell has a presence there for 40 plus years. And the Brazilian government had this program to send students abroad, but you had to find someone that would accept you. So I applied, and my here, a senior scientist here, accepted. He had no idea what he was doing. And thanks God.
In hiring you or in the
Yeah, in hiring me. In hiring me, because I email him and say, hey, I have this scholarship. It's everything covered. So do you want someone to work for you for free? And he said, of course. So, and I got here and I never left. So that was January 2017. And I remember they invited me to speak in one of the climate cafes. And my presentation was like, I ended up here because everything I tried went wrong. I wanted to live in a farm, but you know, small farmers in Brazil, they go bankrupted very often. That's what happened to my family. So I was forced to go to school, not only because of that, but also because my parents made me to. And then I went to master and PhD, and I found out that nature is it's very basic for agriculture. And I said, okay, let's fight for that. And the best place to do is Woodwell.
So we'll go to you in a minute, Jose, but I wanted to follow up on one thing you said, which was the agricultural productivity, the farms need the forests. And I think many of you kind of associate Woodwell with, we're thinking about trees, we're thinking about tropical forests, we're thinking about protecting them. But I think that's a really important point. So if you could elaborate a little bit on the sort of the relationship between, well, some of the places that we work in agriculture in Brazil, talk about what it looked like 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, what it looks like now, and then how we and you are working to try to end deforestation in these regions.
Yeah, so let's think about the market. The market for crops, like cash crops, and the market for land. This has increased a lot. The pressure of this market has increased a lot for the last 50 years in Brazil. So those smallholders producing with like low productivity, they are giving place to those industrial scale farming systems that wants to take advantage of all pieces of land. Brazil, thanks to all the efforts of people like the Woodwell scientists and the IPAM scientists working there. IPAM is our sister organization in Brazil. Thanks to those people and the policymakers concerned about native vegetation, Brazil has a very strong law protecting those areas. But beyond that, the areas that could be legally taken down, they are taken down. They are being taken down to give place to agriculture. So globally, agriculture is responsible for 90% of deforestation. In Brazil, these numbers are coming down now, but still it's a problem. So 50 years ago, we had this landscape of like small scale farming, but now we are seeing more and more the agriculture spending over not only the Amazon. Amazon is something that it was kind of under control, but if you can say that losing 3,000 square kilometers a year of forest is under control, it's not. But it's also moving to Cerrado. Cerrado is the Brazilian savanna and also the dry forest that we were talking about before here. So, this is causing a lot of instability. 90% of the agriculture in Brazil is rain-fed, which means that we don't have irrigation. We depend solely on rainfall. And those native vegetations, they are responsible for bringing this moisture and the rainfall. And let me tell you that I'm not a good climatologist. Of course, I'm a biologist by training. So Michael asked me to run a model to understand the climatological things behind the presence of forest influencing the crop yields. I had no idea how to do that. But I knew how to do the amount of forest, like in a model, like in a simple model, modeling the crop yield as a function of the amount of forest. And that's what I did. And I got a very good result. And we saw that 44% of the amount of the crop yields, soybean yields, were explained by the forest amount on the local landscape. And that was huge. And now he wants me to investigate the mechanisms, but I don't know how to do that. So that's why I'm here, because climatologists here are very nice, so they are going to investigate those mechanisms for me. We just approved a grant to do that. So yeah, thanks God and fingers crossed we are going to manage to do that. But that's it. As we have forests, like more forests in the local landscape, it increases the soybean yield, and that's what we are trying to defend.
May I add a little bit on this? So Ludmila, Chris Neal, John Sanderman, and I last year, we did a field trip to Brazil. We visited Tanguro, which is a research station maintained by IPAN, but also we also support like the work there. And we had the privilege to visit Tanguro, but also a few farms. So I mentioned to you like in the beginning of my conversation that I have this connection to croplands, and one of my uncles, who was like a small local farm in the South Brazil, 10 years ago, he migrated to Mato Grosso, which is closer to this Amazon edge. But he went to a location where there's a bunch of degraded pastures, and he's converting these degraded pastures to croplands. But still, the landscape is so patched. There's like some native forest there, some croplands. And when we visited him, and we were like driving, he was driving us on his car, and he said, oh, you see like this Cerrado, the Savannah, you know, like the property owner, he's leasing that property. He said that he's considering, unfortunately, deforesting that part of the forest because, as Ludmila told, there's a very strong regulation, but still, if there's like some sort of forest surplus, some farmers, they can still, you know, legally deforestate and, you know, clean the area. And then that just, you know, for me, it was really hard to speak with him and try to bring the value of forest, because as Ludmila pointed, like forests are really important for this integrated approach, like integrated landscapes, you know, the rivers, the flying rivers, the biodiversity, the water cycle in these local regional landscapes. And then Woodwell with Francis Seymour, Glenn Bush, Wayne, they are working on this tropical forest forever facility. And this, was something that just reminded me, like these farmers, they have this surplus of forest, but they must be paid to keep that forest up and you know, to value the carbon, to value the water cycle, to value everything that is still there. And so, there's still a lot of debate around this topic. And sometimes, as I have this connection, close connection to farmers, it's really hard to bring this conversation to them, because us as scientists, we focus like on the carbon, the soils, on the climate, but for them, it's more like these direct effects and how they can make money from their own land, right? So it's really hard to make this conversation with them.
So maybe say a little bit more about this. And if you had to make the business case to a landowner, to a farmer in the Amazon about why they shouldn't cut down the trees, what is that case? How can you, I mean, I understand you just described how it's a challenge, but if you had to try to make that the business case, where do you go with that?
So maybe I can just give some numbers, and then Ludmila, she can complement. So now in the tropics, unfortunately, everything is around soybeans, right? And so the cost of opportunity for that property owner is really, okay, so if I can clean my land to grow soybeans, I should be, you know, the lease for that purpose should be 8 sacks, or maybe when you convert, it's gonna be like $100 per hectare. So per year. So ideally, to really avoid or make sure, or from an economical standpoint, like to make sure the farmer or the owner, he's not going to deforestate. He needs to be paid around that value because that's the cost of opportunity. But from this economical standpoint, but the message also should be how we include these climate benefits, how we include like this water cycle, the carbon that can be lost from this land. So it's, something that we need to think more about. And I think Ludmila, she can bring a perspective on that as well.
Yeah, I was telling Karen before this talk. I feel like we are trying to herd chickens, all like many chickens at once. And if you let one chicken go away, all the others we're gonna follow. So yeah, we need to work on all fronts to make the case. LCI, are you familiar with LCI? Landscape Capital Index is a very nice nature-based solution index developed by Woodwell globally, and lets us to compare carbon in the Amazon versus carbon in India. So thanks to that index, we were able to prioritize some areas for restoration and other areas to be carbon market projects. And we were evaluating the revenues that the farmer could have out of, first, restoring the area and selling the carbon. Second, actually first, conserving the area, not deforesting whatsoever. Second, restoring it and creating those projects versus raising cattle. And the revenues over time were more stable with the carbon market. But we need to work on that and make sure that all the rules are on place, because in Brazil, we are 5 years behind what we should be in terms of discussing the carbon market rules in the country. Yeah, this is one thing. The other thing is the TFFFF. Have you ever heard of that? This is amazing. This is amazing. I was explaining that to my father, and I grabbed like a can of beer, and I said, before, this is the amount of money that we had to conserve forests, tropical forests. And now we have the entire brewery to do that. It's a fund that we need to reach $10 billion by the end of this year. And it's going to compensate, it's $4 per hectare of avoided deforestation. And 70 countries in the tropics are going to benefit out of that if they avoid deforestation and avoid degradation. And I wanna talk about that.
Keep going.
The degradation so far, it's only fire scars. So they overlap fire scar maps with forest, and they consider that degraded or not. But we are pushing for more ambition. And what we are trying to do is that the TFFF framework considers Woodwell's framework to identify degradation. And we consider fragmentation, which is like in how many pieces the forest is divided. Droughts, no, not drought. Droughts are very tricky. It's fragmentation, oh my God, fire, of course, and invasive species. Yeah, the three of them. So we are trying to convince them to use this other map. And this is a fund that is going to be seated at the World Bank. And it's very promising. So fingers crossed, we are going to reach the 10 billion. We are now in 6.5, but Norway said that they are going to keep their 3 billion there if we manage to raise the other 3.5. I'm saying we because Woodwell is deeply involved with that.
You thought I was hitting you up for $10 a month. Jose, so Luigi flies around up here a lot, 30,000 feet, and science and ideas and so on. Your science, a lot of it's kind of on the ground, looking at the soil and more in the dirt and the weeds. And maybe just describe a little bit about your kind of day-to-day science and what you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason I came to join at Woodwell was because when I was, in school studying agronomy, I also learned how to code, how to use models, how to, crunch data to get insights. And here at Woodwell, we are basically developing some technology that farmers, ranchers, project developers, industry, they are really interested to really measure soils at scale, at reduced cost, faster. So that's one aspect of my research as an early career scientist. The other aspect is really understanding how, these transformations that are happening in the farms, farmers, they are using cover crops in these commercial fields. They are applying, biological inputs. They are using different species, mixing different species. How we represent that in the models, and then how good we can estimate the change that are going to happen in the soils. And essentially, if it's, for example, it's going to store more carbon or release carbon, which is very important for these carbon programs. And the other aspect is, trying to work more closely with farmers. So John Sanderman, we have several partners here in the West. Like we are part of a on-farm network. So there are about like 15 to 30 sites across the US, and farmers, they are being paid to apply some of these more sustainable practices, like using cover crops, using different species. And the plan is to track, the change in soils, how the soil health is changing, how the economical benefits from transitioning to a more sustainable farming. And so we are basically collecting that data, putting the models, and then scaling across the whole US. That's one thing I'm doing. And still, there's a lot of opportunity for other directions. For example, now enhanced rock weathering is also a big thing. And that's something Ludmila, Joe, and we are also interested, Chris Neal, how we can explore, how we can leverage. It's a technology that...
So you said enhanced rock weathering. So
Yes.
it's probably, if you can explain that a little bit, most people probably aren't familiar with that.
Yeah, for sure. It relates to, some sort of geoengineering. So how can I say? Yeah, it's a technology. So essentially farmers, they're going to crunch some rocks, and these rock finally ground, they're going to be applied in these cropland soils. And when this rock is in the soils, because the rain, so the raindrops, they contain some of the dissolved carbon dioxide. And so there's a chemical reaction in the soils, because with soils, the raindrops, and this powder rock, and this is going to, the potential is to suck some of, this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then a new molecule, like the bicarbonate, is formed in the soils, gets into the water streams, then, moves away and reach to the oceans, where this carbon is stored deep in the ocean. So it's essential, so enhanced, because this is a natural process that is happening on Earth's crust, Earth's surface. We know which rocks works best. And now we just need to create like these logistics and make sure farmers, they are able to apply this rock dust. And then we also need to know how much carbon we're sequestering via this technology. So there's a lot of questions, uncertainty, but something that we want to touch and investigate more here at Woodwell as well, and also with partners.
So we're going to open it up for questions in a few minutes, but we'll go back and forth a little bit more before then. So I was at a film festival in Colorado as of a few days ago, and we had several of our scientists and staff there. And it's not just films, it's discussion and stuff like this, right? And one of the panel discussions was on regenerative agriculture. Jenny Watts, one of our scientists, was on that panel. And there was also a farmer from Iowa who had been farming, I think he said 44 years, and he farms 45,000 acres, and he grows corn and soy. The market for corn is to make ethanol to throw into fuel, and I think soy maybe was animal feed. I don't remember, but if you could talk a little bit about what the crops are that are grown in the regions of the Amazon that you work in, that we work in, and then what the market is for those crops. What's driving it? What's driving that agriculture?
Yeah, so when we visit Mato Grosso, we saw like many facilities being built to use corn and millet as a source of this biofuel. Millet is better because it has less water as a byproduct. So, but there are like many things. First of all, José touched on a very sensitive matter, which is oh, let's use degraded areas, degraded pasture lands to grow those kind of crops to produce biofuel and rely less on fossil fuels. And we were like, yeah, this sounds like the silver bullet. And I was talking with some business guy, and he said, yes, make this case. And the Petrobras, or like the Brazilian oil company, is gonna put a lot of money in biofuels and fossil fuels. So if you prove that this is like financially viable, that's what it's gonna happen. But growing crops on those degraded areas, it's like insane. It's so hard to do. There's a reason they are degraded. They are degraded because they are hard to manage. So just very people with a lot of courage, like your relatives, like I would never do that, and they are trying and they are struggling, and it's a lot of work. But still, it's increasing a lot. But we need to learn some lessons from Europe. Europe 10 years ago, they changed a lot. They started to produce a lot of crops for biofuel, and they created a problem on food security. So let's use that as a lesson. I'm not sure if we are good as humanity in learning lessons, but we need to. And that needs to be really well planned. And with the upcoming, probably very intense El Nino, I think farmers are going to switch to more resistant crops. Millet is one of those. So let's see what's going to happen the next season. It's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, like comparing U.S. agriculture with the tropics, like Brazil specifically, it's a great exercise. So the main difference, so here in the West, usually farmers, they are able to grow only a season. In Brazil, in some regions, especially in Mato Grosso, the center of Brazil, they can grow, for example, soybeans as a first main crop, and then corn. And then the main reason, like these ethanol facilities, they were being built is because so they can leverage like the sun, they can leverage the rain because of these two crops in the same year. And yeah, so I think that was also one of the drivers why ethanol is also becoming a big thing now. And what else? Another difference is about like cover crops in general. They are a bit different. They work, the principles are pretty much the same, but it's also very context specific. And last year when we visited my uncle, I asked him, okay, so what are your main concerns? As you came from the south of Brazil, you're here now 10 years, you are struggling, but at the same time he's thriving because he was able to manage that soil. It's a very unique type of soil. And before I tell what are the main concerns, so Ludmila, he mentioned that he published a paper a few years ago, like on these climate shifts, right? So how the climate is shifting in the south, in the central Brazil. So the Amazon has provided like this, some climate benefit or stability for the farmers. So the reason they all migrated to Mato Grosso, to the savannas, was because the flying rivers, they were stable, predictable, but now with these increased deforestation rates, with the changes are happening, we are seeing so many shifts in the climate patterns. And then more recent, like in this last 10 years, several El Nino, La Nina events, and these are, many farmers are going bankrupt, okay? And then last year, when we visited my uncle, he said the rain was delayed. So they were supposed to be planting soybeans like in October, November, late October, beginning of November. We were there specific on that date. He was planting, but the rain, wasn't coming, and then was able to get only by the end of November. So he lost a lot of seeds. He had to replant, and when I asked him, is this like something you are, really concerned about, like this changing climate and all the effects you are having? He said yes. So we chat a lot, like on WhatsApp, and he asked, "Oh, what is the weather forecast?" But the main concern now is also the fire. So many scientists here at Woodwell, they are investigating fire in the Arctic. They are investigating fire, in the tropics as well. So sometimes it starts in croplands and spreads over natural forests. But now farmers, they are also struggling with that because the role, the rationale behind conservation, regen agriculture, like protecting soils, cover crops, dry biomass. So they need to keep that biomass on top of soil to, sustain the health, to protect them from erosion. But when the fire comes, devastate, devastate everything, and then they lose a lot of money in the next crop. The soil health goes away. So yeah, so many transformations, so many challenges are coming, and especially with this strong El Nino that is, expect to come this year. I think it's going to be quite challenging for them in the tropics.
Questions from the audience? Pat? I don't care the order.
I'm wondering, when you say the changes, is this from climate change or is this from deforestation creating a local change because there's not as many trees to keep the rain?
That's a good question. I think
the answer is probably yes, right?
Ludmila, she did that study.
Yeah, both. The coupling, which is like I want to use my hands. The coupling, which is like the relationship between land use and climate, is very strong in the tropics and is stronger in the Amazon. So if you cut down a single tree, I'm not talking about the carbon, I'm talking just about deforestation. If you cut down a single tree, it's like 300 liters of water that stops returning to the atmosphere every day. To do that, do you know when you put alcohol in your skin and you feel it's a bit colder? It's because it's consuming energy. So for the trees, it's the same. They consume energy in order to transpire that water back to the atmosphere. And they consume the same amount of energy as 2 air conditioner units per hour. It's a lot of energy that stays there. So what's the real impact in the local landscape? If you deforest totally the Southeast Amazonia, it's going to increase 5 degrees C. How much is 5 degrees C in Fahrenheit, Chris New, please?
10, 12.
How many? 9 Fahrenheit. And in general, if you the general impact of the Amazon is 2C. So in some areas, the forest is more needed than the others. Why so? Because those areas are already deforested and are very near the edge. So forests are more needed in those areas with more deforestation. So it's the two forcings. One, because of the land use change, and the other one because of the global climate change. Together, they are a disaster.
Yeah, sort of maybe a big question, high-level question. Are we still heading south? Things are getting worse, or is the slope just changed, either in deforestation or carbon, whatever you're looking at? Are things still getting worse, or have we turned the corner and the inflection point is already there, or we still have a long ways to go?
I'll let them answer, but I'll say these are two people that don't like the expression heading south and being bad.
No, I love it. Going south is amazing. If you want to come to our farm, you are going to have the best cut of pork if the neighbor kills the pig. But a quick step on that depends on what's your baseline. So deforestation rates in Brazil, they were like skyrocketing before 2004. And then they started to come down. And then they went up a little bit, and now they're going down again. Is it enough? No, because we cannot sustain losing forests as we are still losing. But we are like doing better than we were before. Globally speaking, we could do a better work. So in 2024, we lost, it was an insane number. I'm trying to remember here. I won't say any figure because it was like an insane number. It was 7 billion square kilometers. It was crazy big. Because here, the temperate forests, we are cutting a lot in the south and not recomposing them in the north. And in the north, they are being taken down by fires. So the general pattern is horrible. So we are going quite north on that. But we are also more concerned about it. And the international community is focused a lot on it. And the COP30 presidency launched the roadmap to halt and reverse deforestation and forest degradation by 2030. And Woodwell is helping to draw this roadmap, and mostly by creating this table on who should do what by when and who is responsible for leading this group. So we are making it very clear what we need to do. And it's a very short period of time to execute the plan, but we need to get close, at least.
I just want to add one more comment to the pattern that you described of very high deforestation rates, say 20 years ago, and then it went like this, and then this pattern. So the going down was President Lula. The going up was President Bolsonaro. The going down that we're in right now is President Lula. Where we go from here, who knows? And as a 501c3, I won't say anything more about elections.
Yeah, I also want to add, like, on this, going south, or, where we are heading to. And I just want to mention about, like, this climate stability and, the spread, these climate events, extremes, they are happening more frequently in these croplands, in these farms. But farmers, with this regen agriculture, conservation agriculture, it's not only important for, like, a mitigation standpoint, trying to offset some of the emissions that happened in the past, but also they are making farmers and croplands more adapted to these events. And I think, like, usually we are only concerned about, like, the emissions, but it's really important from this social aspect. They are going to be more resilient and prepared for this, right? So I see, like, conservation agriculture is only increasing around the globe. Now with regen, trying to mimic, like, this ecological process, what is happening in nature, farmers, they are aware how important is that, and trying to bring some of those principles back to their land. If it's like a local agroforest, like a small farm, but also like these commercial big farmers, they are, for example, using cover crops, they are using enhanced rock weathering, they are mixing, planning much better, like when they're going to be planting. They are using biological inputs, so instead of applying chemicals to control disease and pests, they are now using some biological control. So there's some bacteria, some fungi that can be, you can create a soup, and that soup will help them fight these pests and disease. And this is really good for the soil health, for the, the biodiversity in those regions.
I just had a question about, you mentioned that you can pay farmers to not
To avoid deforestation.
deforestation.
Legal
Okay.
deforestation.
So are these people selling their farms completely, or are they just selling part of their farms? I mean, I would imagine there's a way of life that they don't want to give up, maybe. Is the payment sustainable for the culture?
Yeah. So first of all, they don't sell it; they lease it. So we have this project. We started in 2017. It's called Conserve. It was developed by Woodwell, EPAM, Amazonia, and EDF, and the Environmental Defense Fund. So we developed this as a proof of case to see if farmers would give up this right of deforesting in exchange of like a contract signed by X years, paid Y amount per hectare and everything. So we interviewed the farmers to get to know what they wanted. So the contracts were designed more or less what they wanted. And we had this project for 5 years. And now we moved the project from, it was like mostly in the Amazon region. And now this project is going on in the Cerrado region. And it worked quite well because by the end of the contract, just 1 out of the 25 farmers deforested the area, because that needs to come with education. you need to send them information about how important that piece of forest is for the sustainability of his business or her business. I'm talking his because, oh my God, most of them are men. All of them are men. All of them are men. So yeah, we are trying to solve other problems. And so we reach out to them, and we monitor those farms to see. So it was a very good successful rate so far. But if you don't keep doing the education part, once the money is cut, they deforest because of the opportunity cost that José talked about.
From a climate point of view and carbon capture point of view, how does reforestation, new growth forest, compare with old growth forest?
It will depend on what kind of forest we are talking about. Some are arguing now that forests should be considered as a continuum and not discriminating what kind of forest is. So for those local effects on mitigating, like decreasing the temperature, forest plantation, like the monoculture of forest, doesn't work. Because the reason that forests decrease the temperature locally, it's because of their canopy roughness. And the monoculture doesn't have that. It's like even. Also, there are changes in the albedo and evapotranspiration, but those plantations, they don't work. It's a way better, it's like the proportion is 1:7. It's 7 times better to conserve a piece of forest, of old forest, for the local climate and for the carbon perspective than restoring, like investing in restoration. Another thing is the time to reach what it was before deforestation. We asked a question on how long it would take and how many hectares it would take to replace 1 hectare of old forest that is cut down. And the answer is way worse than we thought. First, we need at least, depend on the sub-basin in the Amazon, we need at least 7 hectares of restoration to replace 1 hectare of forest. And the problem is the time. There's nothing before 40 years. And some of them take 600 years to compensate for that. So conservation needs to be the number 1, number 2, number 3 strategy. And restoration, we need that, but we need to talk about that later on. And that's not what's happening, because a lot of money is being invested in restoration. But as Eric Davidson used to say, like the tail is wagging the dog on that, because there's no reason to invest more in restoration than in conservation.
One of the challenges, it's easy for anybody to see that carbon is accumulating in a growing forest, in a restored forest. You know, you start in a bare field and you see small trees and they slowly are getting bigger. So they think, okay, we're storing away carbon. But as Luigi mentioned, it takes an incredibly long time to build up the carbon that was in the original forest that was deforested. And that's not to mention everything else you get with a intact mature forest, from biodiversity and water cycling and all these other co-benefits. So that's why most of our work is focused on what can we do to keep the intact forest standing, and it's very secondary. It's still important, as Luigi mentioned, but it's not where our focus is. How do you restore the degraded forest?
So I have a question. If we, as a planet, implemented all the carbon capture and carbon preservation strategies in agriculture that we know about, would we still be as productive? Would we be able to feed 9 billion people on the planet?
Yeah, maybe, yeah. We are working on that right now. So yeah, some partners from my, some partners of John Sanderma, they published recently a paper on Nature, like, so yeah, there are some trade-offs. If you adopt, if farmers, they are able to adopt like these sustainable management practices, restore the carbon, maybe some use, they may drop a little bit. in some locations. So the co-benefits are not constant over the world. And another study that we are also working is essentially, so John and I, we are working on this, on a new modeling. He did a work in 2017, how much carbon was lost due to agriculture in the last 20,000 years, you know, because it's been around for thousands of years. And now we are looking to the future, how much carbon can be put back to the soil via agriculture, via regen agriculture, conservation agriculture. And some of the initial results are, we are not going to, it's going to be hard to go back to the same numbers. So maybe we can offset like 50%, 60% of what was lost in the past. So there's a lot to be done. Not only like improving croplands, but also other types of management in forests and you know, other sectors.
I remember a figure of this paper. They were comparing what if we do cover crop with legume versus grasslands. And one of them would pull up like 40 petagrams of carbon by the end of this century, but would not produce not produce 8 petagrams of carbon worth of food, because they transformed food in terms of petagram of carbon just to make comparable. So it was like 40 petagrams of carbon pulled out of the atmosphere, but would not produce the food, using one scenario versus the other. And for me, at least, the conclusion was like, we need to raise the bar of ambition. So when we are talking about regenerative agriculture in the tropics, we are talking way more than just looking to the egg plot. We need to look into the landscape and manage the landscape. We need all the pieces together of the landscape in order to solve the climate crisis and produce food.
I have time for maybe one more question.
Going back to degraded lands, are there any affordable fertilizers or sustainable irrigation techniques that can help people grow on those?
Yeah, so enhanced rock weathering, one of the co-benefits of, you know, applying this rock dust is really, there's some nutrients in the rock. So it's cheap, so we are gonna be sequestering carbon, but also releasing nutrients for the plants. So that's a win-win solution for reducing the cost for restoring those lands and providing some of the nutrients that crops and grasses, they need to fully grow. And in terms of irrigation, I think that's another thing. And as Ludmila said, like most of the croplands, they are rain-fed, right? And I would say like there are some solutions for small-scale agriculture, but for these large-scale commercial ones, they need to invest like in these center pivots and specifically for restoring this degraded land, maybe it's not feasible. And yeah.
Squeeze in one more question if anyone has one. Yeah.
My question is about fertilizers too, and I'm interested in what you can do about the use of glyphosate. I just read an article recently about in this Mother Jones publication about how outside of Lake Tahoe area, they were having natural fires in the forest, and the forest became, they burned down, but when they regenerated naturally, they came back with all the diverse biodiversity of all the different plants and whatever, the pollinators and everything. But when there's this company called Bayer Monsanto that is using lots and lots of fertilizer to create artificially grown trees now. They want to create their own forest. So they're planting like monocrop conifers and they first apply glyphosate to the original forest, destroy that, and then plant their conifers. So what do you do about that? Is there anything to stop the fertilizers?
Oh my God. Where's that? Where's that happening? Where is that happening?
In Northern California, right near Lake Tahoe. there's an article about it in this Mother Jones publication. I don't know if you're familiar
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah, that's a big issue, and one of the main concerns about, maybe I can relate to enhanced rock weathering, is like how farmers they are gonna be supplied by these rocks, right? If someone needs to mine a very specific rock in Iceland to ship that rock dust to the US and then applying the cropland, doesn't make any sense from a greenhouse gas emissions standpoint. So they must be locally sourced. So not all regions in the world they hold this potential to use this technology. And some of the papers I saw on literature, usually they should be within 500 kilometers to offset to be net zero when using enhanced rock weathering and supplying nutrients from the rocks as well.
On that, so all the evidence, not only scientific evidence, the evidence of like the day-by-day activity are showing that less diversity is less resilience, and the losses are certain. Like now that we are on pressure, like on the edge the whole time, it's El Nino after La Nina, and always like extreme weather events and those dry spells, hot spells. Like there's no place for trying those absurd things. And I know Bayer works a lot in Brazil, and they are operating in the opposite direction. At least they are like with the Pro Carbon project that are trying to bring more like knowledge, but still, the thing is, the technical assistance is it was kidnapped by those big companies. So there is no much place for those bio inputs and regenerative agricultural practices, the indigenous knowledge, the local community knowledge, because they kidnapped all the people giving technical assistance. They are from those companies. So we need to work a lot, and there are like some initiatives trying to create agronomy schools in Brazil that would push for regenerative agriculture. There's also like a group of farmers in Goiás that is trying to create that in order to teach new agronomists new ways of dealing with the land.
So thank you all for being here. Please join me in thanking Luigi and Jose. Hope to see you all back here June 10th for more, as I said, locally focused agriculture. And we have a few empty seats, so bring a friend along with you.